All right. We are here with episode 4 of Marvels of Audio. We have a very special episode today. We're having a little guest star here. I have here Monty, good friend of mine. Um, and we had a little bit of a banter about actually it was I think it was Charlie that recommended I should talk to you about your documentary since it has a focus on like an aspect of community, which is the goal here of the podcast. So we've been in the talks for this a bit. I'm really happy I was able to get this so early in the season because usually this doesn't happen until like the latter half of the season. But Monty, if you want to give like a quick hello to everyone and all that.
Hey, my name is Monty, and yeah, like Dalen said, I'm working on a podcast appropriately called Craving Community about a handful of things, but mainly about the way adults are gathering in sober or sober adjacent spaces, mainly alcohol free, exploring what it means to be sober and what it means to have community focused on things that aren't partying and intoxication.
Yeah. We talked briefly during trying to figure out like the focus we wanted to have on the episode, which was like a bit of piggybacking off the last episode, which is like role models and role models, mentors, specifically in like media as well. But before we get into like the rare red meat of it, I want to open up a little more on your uh, craving community, and what I want to ask is what would you say is like the one thing you're trying to capture above all else with a craving community? Like, what is the single focal point that you're trying to capture?
I think I was inspired by this after hanging out at the local Kava and Kratom bar, Roots and Leaves, and for the first time in my life, at least as an adult, having community that is not focused on seeing like how drunk you can get or whatever intoxicants of choice. Until this year, I self-identified as a pothead. So since I was like 18 years old, almost at a year without smoking. So there's that. But I wanted to explore how like my generation was brought up to conflate community with intoxication, and like we were brought up to romanticize those moments where you're either really drunk or you're on a lot of whatever, and you're like sitting next to your bro and you're finally like, man, I love you, and I can't believe like we finally had this revelation together. And I wanted to explore the idea that while I'm thankful for many of the experiences I've had, it's way like we've been trained to look at that as the ideal, and I'm kind of just sick of that. I have so much more community and so many more close friends now that we are just like hanging out, not trying to be as messed up as we can, not needing alcohol or other substances to bring down those walls, and learning how to connect on a very authentic and present moment. Like seeking presence has been a focus of mine for a while now, maybe since like 2016 or 2017 when I read The Presence Process, and started really, I've been doing yoga for like 15 years now or something, and just the idea of being present and holding space with yourself and with others in a way that's like authentic and grounded.
That's awesome. That that alone it was like the whole reason why I was so happy to have you on the podcast today. I really resonate with that message because I kind of talked to you a little bit about it, like in the little briefing for this, where like I wanted to start my podcast as well. Not particularly with like, uh, the influences of other like settings and stuff, but specifically raise up other areas, like mainly like mental health. That's what I mostly talk about on this podcast. I actually had a close friend of mine during the pandemic, like closer towards the end of 2020, 2021, that really got into like that alpha male stuff, just like the whole mindset of like when you're hanging out with people, when you're with your girl, when you're with your bros, when you're in like any environment, you got to be like the buckle up by the bootstraps kind of guy, tough, top dog in the building, essentially. And it's really inspiring to see you making a project that helps people, that we don't have to be a part of that norm, that toxic culture, I would call it. I feel like it's an appropriate way to call it, like the whole party mindset, frat boy stuff, the alpha male stuff, and all that. It's really cool.
Thanks. I think there is. I think like my goal for like a while now, and maybe most of my life without even realizing it, is, finding like those like healthy mediums and places to have like the rational conversation, because I think we live in a society now that's been on, I mean, it's hard to say. We could go all the way back to Edward Bernays if you really want to get into like the development of the HR departments and PR departments and focus groups, and how we've been trained as a society to be certain ways. But I think, when you think of like the toxic alpha male or the toxic, like, I mean, there's like any archetype of a human being. I mean, even within like sober culture can become toxic,
Mm-hmm.
and so one of the other notions I'm exploring is, like, what does it even mean to be sober? Because ultimately I think it's about, who you're surrounding yourself with, because without having like grounded, rational conversations about things, you can end up with like that toxic masculine like archetype that goes so far in a direction, and then that makes, healthy masculinity look good, which is, I think is something we're struggling with as a society, is where we're just going so far in certain directions, especially with like influencer culture, where people need to take on the identity, and you look at, some toxic, I don't want to drop names, like we have some of these like toxic male archetypes in society that, like, if you look at like why they started on the trajectory that they're on, like at some point it was like rational, at some point it made sense because they were frustrated with something in their community or in society, or the demonization, this isn't a thing about masculinity, but it's like they were, it got demonized at some point, and then they went so hard in a direction, and I think that happens with party culture, when we were raised on things like Animal House and, Super Bad and, Harold and Kumar and Cheech and Chong, that taught you to identify, I went to college and learned to identify as a pothead, and like made it part of like the people I hang out with, and like what I thought was like part of who I am, and what I needed to be creative, and what I needed to be into Pink Floyd and all these things. Whereas like there's like a way to do it in a mindset that's like healthy. It's like I don't think there's anything immoral about smoking pot or drinking alcohol or trying mushrooms, but I think when it becomes your identity, it's like being
like a core feature, essentially.
yeah, when it's like how you identify, it's like oh, I am a, like I promote being a pothead on social media, or I promote being like this alpha male on Instagram. I promote like, mushrooms are the savior to the world on Instagram. It's like, can't we just like take a few steps back and realize, like, one, there's nothing wrong with like any of this inherently, but when it's like you're spending all of your time, and like we can only be friends if we're drinking together, we can only be friends if we're smoking together, or we can only be friends if we're doing, anything. Like there's so many identities that people latch onto when it's just like, hey, well, first we're just a human, you know, and like let's just be real, and like I can be friends with you if you're not a pothead. It's like
I like that you say that like the whole like the focus on the environment thing, because like that is a thing I notice in a lot of communities where it's like sometimes people are just like, yeah, we can hang out, but it has to be here, like it has to be part of the, you know, the area where we met, the community we're a part of, and the archetypes of humans. Because what I personally, I ultimately think everyone is like a melting pot in a sense. We all have little features, little core features that make us all the different individuals. I One thing I often see people, at least in my like small little life of 25, 24 years I've lived so far, is a lot of people in my age demographic will find a community and like really stick to it, and like they make that their identity. They're like, I am not me, I am this community, and that is who I am.
mm-hmm.
Kind of like the whole idea of like not really throwing your name out to be a cog in a mindless machine, whether it makes something good or bad, but it feels more like I want to say like some form of like disconnect from like very personalized, authentic connections with individuals within the community, and just kind of throwing everyone into one little bundle essentially, instead of recognizing each and every person that makes that machine, whether it's like like the disconnect thing, or maybe it's just like some autopilot. Um, I'm very big on like the saying, like, everything in moderation, because it's exactly like you said. Uh, no matter what community it really is, it can get toxic, it can get bad, it can kind of lose its own identity
Mm-hmm.
with an agenda being pushed forward, or something within it gets like exaggerated to a point. Es- Especially like a thing in music too, like all media, like you said earlier. I'm actually curious. Is that something you go over in a Craving community? Is that like a subject you touch on? The whole like role models, and like whether they're real people or fictional characters, or something even like more abstract, being like influences on people.
Yeah, that is a notion that I'm, exploring. Is I think there is something, to be said as society's been growing and we've been less focused on like the family unit or like your personalized community. Now that as communities move online and we can get more specific, and pop culture just gets so much more prevalent, whether or not you have a you know like people identify with genres of music, and people identify with like film directors, and I think there is something to be said about how like there's people who would be like, oh man, all of my philosophies come from Kubrick films, and it's like, okay, well, first off, like I agree he's one of the best, but also it's like maybe you shouldn't like put so much on a person that like you don't know, because like everything is so showy nowadays, especially like with influencers. Like we've moved from like celebrity culture to influencer culture, and influencers so much more like you get like the successful ones become such a niche and such a like a fake archetype, and like they go so hard in certain directions, and they become role models for people, especially younger people, like teenagers that are on, I don't want to say Instagram because I'm 40, but TikTok or whatever the medium is, they follow these people and just take their word as like real advice. And a lot of these people are, young, like there's influencers that are like 10, 11 years old, in their teens and their 20s. The older I get, the more I'm like, well, I just turned 40, and like now I'm like, well, I didn't know anything in my 30s. It's like who's anybody to give advice to the public? And we find that role model in pop culture now. He's like, we don't have them personally in our lives anymore. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
I felt like that was
It's
a
like
weird little
perfectly.
rant.
It's pretty good. Like nail in the coffin right there. I think it's interesting because like, especially like, because like I grew up with the internet. I grew up with social media. Like I remember when I was 12, and they're like, yeah, the internet's older than you. It's only like, I think when I was 12, it was like 15, 20 years old. or something. I could totally be wrong about that. But that came as a shock to me. I could not imagine a world without the internet. And I remember like the very like formula of like if I saw like someone on like Instagram with like 500,000 followers and they were giving advice, I was like, it's like just something that just automatically turns into your brain. Not an exact process for everyone, but it's just like, oh, 500,000 people listen to what this person says. Obviously, they must be onto something and stuff like that. It's really easy to get into it, especially when it's like really bite sized nowadays, like bite sized, like 30-second videos of just talking about something. It just slips into your conscious, like really, really easy. Imagine that was like the same thing with celebrities too. It's just like all these people love this guy's work. So when they say something that like, you know, is supposed to be advice or whatever, people kind of like just, how would I say it? They don't really digest it. They kind of just copy paste it into what I want to say, like their psyche, you know? I feel like that's a like big thing that's missing right now. People don't really explore it on their own. They don't give it any nuance.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think that that's true. And nuance is the word, because you can't have, like, I mean, people have been trying to have the same nuanced discussions for, centuries now, and that's how long it takes to have a nuanced
Yeah.
the discussion. That when you have like this influencer, especially, when, like a lot of times they're so specific, like maybe like this person's like giving this piece of advice that is like very specific to like their life, and I have no context for their life because nobody wants to put their real life on here. And so it's like I just take this thing that sounds good. We hear it's like so much in like the political landscape, especially, where it's like there's like these bite-sized things that like taste good, but then if you like really put them in context, you're like, oh, it's actually like much more complicated than this. But the world is so complicated, as we like move towards like, like, I mean, not even move towards, we're already in like a global economy or a global conversation, like whether or not the one world government exists yet or not. It's like we exist with so many cultures that are just like butting heads, not because they're like they don't like each other, but just because like it happens so quickly. We didn't, it's slowly, it's like when like America started, like people got to slowly assimilate and like, find their community and also how that interacts with the world at large. And now it's just like, bam, everyone's on the internet, and everyone's opinions there, and I can just like filter out who I want to like listen to. And you can do that with, music. Like I'm old enough to remember when like celebrities, like it was kind of taboo for like a musician to come out and like be like, oh, I support this politician. It's like they kind of knew that it's like, hey, this is like complicated, and I'm not trying to be that. I'm just like trying to make music. And nowadays someone like releases like a 30-second TikTok trend, and then all of a sudden they're like, you should believe this,
Yeah.
whether it's political or religious or whatever nuance of the culture or specific part of the culture. They just like want to like rally behind something. We're so tribal, and that's why I think ultimately like it does, like there is like an aching for having communities in person, in physical spaces. And it's so much easier to hang out with people that you have some disagreements with when you're in person. When you're online, you're like, oh, this person is MAGA, or this person is super liberal, or this person is that. Like, I hate them. Whereas like, I have friends that, voted for Trump and Kamala and didn't vote and voted for third party, and who are super involved and who are apathetic. And when you can all hang out, you're just like, this is just like a good person who like has some different opinions than I do, but it doesn't mean like they're bad. We kind of all want the same things, and we're like, radicalized to like hate each other.
Exactly. That's definitely one thing I've definitely seen much more in my age demographic, which was a huge quote that was being tossed around, uh, like during the elections, was like, you don't have to end friendships over politics. And just I saw so many people being like, if you voted for this person, don't ever talk to me. We're not friends anymore. We're acquaintances. We're strangers, or I don't even consider you like I don't think you exist anymore. It's like it's kind of like huge extremes, and it's kind of funny because like that was only something I experienced in like the online atmosphere. But like when I got down to like let's call it the battleground of Santa Fe, essentially. Just it was really cool to like I could go to any bar, even the Roots and Leaves. There were people with varying political opinions, or just everyone was having a good time. Everyone was still chatting despite like polarizing disagreements. Um, I definitely think that's a big result of like environment of where people like spread their moral compass, their philosophies, their ideas, whether it's in a more abstract area like the internet or something more physical where you can actually see the person face to face, handshake them, high five, fist bump. It's kind of interesting. I was wondering from what you've seen so far in like the physical spectrum of environments of communities, what do you think is like a core, like something that really defines a community essentially?
Oh man, that's a complex question. I mean, I think there is like you do need something. You need some commonality. Like at a place like you know Roots and Leaves or here at Remix, there's a lot of rallying behind like alcohol-free culture. Um, here at Remix, there's like a huge, rallying behind like music culture and specifically like DJ. I don't even want to call it culture because that makes it so like specific. Just like, 'cause you can DJ or be interested in DJ or be interested in that type of music without like identifying in that culture, with whatever that even means. But I think there's got to be something. But I think in person it can be looser. When you're online, you join like this subreddit or you follow this person on TikTok or you can join this community that's like, hey, we all love blue and we hate green.
Yeah,
So it's just like, or
exactly.
it's like I like Batman and Spider-Man and Superman are stupid. I hate people that like Spider-Man. Like whatever it is. Whereas like in person, you kind of like, I think there's like you meet people on like, because that like whether or not you like Batman or Superman, like really doesn't say very much about you. But when you're just like in a place and you sit next to someone, especially I think like it's so important in sober spaces because like when you're like drunk, there's like it can get even if you're not intentional, like it has like this air of being a little predatory. Like I found, like at hanging out at Roots and Leaves for years, like you can like sit down and you can like talk. Like if there's a person of the opposite sex or same sex, whatever you're into, like I can sit down and like start talking to the like a girl who just sat down next to me, and she doesn't assume that I'm like trying to sleep with her because there's no alcohol, there's no like we're not like weakened in that sense, so it can just be more authentic. It's like we just happen to be sitting next to each other, and then you can like just talk and like find some common interest, and then by the time you get to who they voted for, you're like, well, I already like this person.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
like
It's great.
they're cool, and it doesn't really matter who they voted for. And we keep coming back to that, but I think that's so like a way we're so radicalized nowadays. Like I like that, like I have friends over there that like I said, like we're comfortable saying like I voted for this person, and no one's like get out. They're like, oh, cool, like I might not agree with you, but like we've been hanging out for 2 years now, and I think you're cool. So like you're a good person. Um, and so I don't even know if I like answered your question, but I think there's just like there's ways to connect on like real human levels and like defining what it means like to like who a person is way more than what movies they like, what songs they listen to, who they vote for, who they date, who they sleep with, what how they present their gender, how they dress, like you're so much more than any of that. And when you're in person, it's easier to realize that, I think. Connect on a more human level. You can just be like, oh, that's just kind of funny. Like, I don't know if I, want to, like, hang out in, like, a really, I don't know if I want to, like, make time to get together, but, like, when we're sitting next to each other, we can just be, like, have some laughs and realize that we're both just honest human beings that, like, for the most part, want the same things for ourselves, our family, our friends, our society.
I think you kind of like glazed over the same idea I had for like what I personally think a community is, which is like whatever like the group is like common rallying is like whether it's a community on music, games, movies, sober culture, or even you can even get niches, Batman, Spider-Man. What I really like in a community are individuals within that community that can talk to, that can identify themselves outside of those communities, like being very authentic, having common interests, and having we can have disagreeing opinions, but like agree to disagree, because like just because you have a different opinion than mine that I could go as far as like I would personally never agree with that. I can still recognize you're a good person or you're a person that's trying to do good and such like that. Uh, Going back down into the focus on individuals on a community, I kind of want to grace on that idea again. You've said you've been interviewing people when we were like briefing this. How has that been so far?
That's been really fun. I realized actually that I really enjoy doing that because I like, something. I like when things are intentional. So, this is like an intentional conversation. Neither of us are like trying to get out of it or something like
Yeah,
that.
exactly.
We're here to explore like a specific idea. So, interviewing people, and so far I've only interviewed people that have been friends of mine. I'm trying to think if there's anybody. I think they've all been friends of mine. And I've worked on other documentaries that aren't mine and been like involved in interviews with non-friends. But like when I actually am conducting the interview, there's something just really enjoyable and you're both trying to like authentically explore something. And like what I'm exploring is not that dangerous. If you want to like sit down sometimes and have conversations on like political agendas or like gender identity, you can like really like some things are really touchy subjects, which is a whole other conversation about how to navigate those types of subjects authentically without while risking being offended, but also realizing that everyone's like just innocently or like authentically trying to explore an idea. I think that it's really, I like having conversations with people, and I like when people are willing to just talk about things and be willing to be questioned and be willing to think about things, and I don't know. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, it was pretty spot on. I like the idea of like whatever the common interest of a conversation is, or maybe it's to explore what similar interests someone has, especially the intentional conversations. Like yeah, we're both discussing the same thing, but it's varying opinions. It's really nice to hear other people's like perspectives or angles on something. Those are like personally, those are my favorite conversations. Expanding on like what things you like, what are things you think about like every day, what are things that are very close and personal to you, like which is basically usually the intention of an interview and all that. Which it's really interesting to me. Out of all the people you've interviewed so far for Craving Community, do any of them like strike out as someone that you could see as a role model in a community or a mentor or something of similar sorts?
Um, you know, in some sense, I think that most people who have reached some, you know, semblance of maturity and focus in their life can be role models in a sense. Um, I think there is. I think that that's like it's a really interesting thing to consider because we put a lot of pressure on some people. For example, I interviewed one guy who is like a musician. He's in his 60s, and he spent a lot of time in the 80s and early 90s being like touring and doing drinking a lot. Like alcohol was his drug of choice, and he was surrounded by people who were doing other drugs, and now is sober. Like in some sense, he can be, inspiring. And there was like somebody else who, was like starting a business, and she could be a role model in some sense. But I think ultimately, you have to hold all of that like with a grain of salt, and knowing that these are also still like flawed individuals who, you can love and like look up to in some sense, but really we're all just people trying to figure it out, like I think we live in a world where like we don't like respect our elders as much. But I think, like if you can like, find, and I haven't interviewed this person yet, somebody who is like, towards the end of their life, in the last like couple decades of their life, who's been through so much and shares a lot of common interests, that person can be a role model. Whereas like your peers, I think you're just like figuring it out together, and so you're like, yeah, your peers. And so, putting pressure on people to be a role model is like, that's like a pretty heavy word versus like somebody who's like, a little inspiring. Does
Yeah.
that make sense?
Yeah, exactly. I would like agree with you wholeheartedly on that. I'm like the same idea like when it comes to like role models or mentors that at the end of the day, it is still someone. It's a human. It's a person. They'll have like, you know, still struggles, maybe things that they could have difficulty articulating or teaching or passing on to others. But I don't, to like put into context what I'm trying to say, I feel like what makes a good role model or mentor, role model being like more of a group of people, mentors like more one on one, is a human or a person that has is very well acquainted and experienced with failure, struggle, stuff like that. People that can really help you navigate through a situation or really think about things that happen to them. Like, there's no better teacher than experience, time, pain, stuff like that, because it teaches you what you did wrong and how you can succeed again. And I think it's really important to have people like that that can, really teach that. Interestingly enough, I think that sometimes, without even pursuing it, people can kind of fall into that role model or mentor position when it comes to a community, whatever, whether it's by like pure accident or just having one enough conversations with people and stuff like that. How do you feel about that idea? People kind of like accidentally falling into that role, just like from the life they've lived, being acquainted with failure.
Um,
Or
I,
more like acquainted with like failure, struggle, like the hardships of life to make it like not so precise and narrow.
I mean, I think, there's a fine line that is different for everybody in every community about, you know, how much you should look up to a person. I think that's very natural, and I think it's good for communities, especially when you're dealing with a community of like, you know, people who are sober, a lot of whom are um like need to be sober because they're addicts. They're in recovery, and maybe they relapse. Maybe they've been sober for 40 years. I think that it is good to have people in the community that can like serve as an example, being like, hey, like I survived. You
Yeah.
can survive. While realizing, that they're still, humans, and they may mess up. I think we see that in like pop culture nowadays, when you have somebody that is like serving as this role model or influencer, and then they get caught in some sort of scandal, and everyone needs to admit, it's like, oh well, I actually didn't know this person, and everybody has their struggles, and everybody makes mistakes. And so like within the sense of community, like on one level, I think it's real. I also think that I'm not an expert on this.
Yeah.
I'm exploring it. I'm witnessing it. I've had, you know, I, like I just turned 40, so like I have friends who are like in their early 20s or in 30s, and I've had people, tell me that they, like look up to me or respect my opinion on some things, and in my mind, I'm just like, man, I still feel like I'm sort of like don't have it all together. It's like I don't know, like maybe you shouldn't think so much of me. But then also it's like, well, I've done a lot of work to not be the person I was in my 20s or early 30s. I've done a lot of work to evolve. So there's like, you know, no, it's interesting because there's so many microcosms within community as well. We have like within some of the communities I'm involved in, like I do jujitsu and yoga at a studio, and so like I interact with like literal teenagers, who are better than me at jujitsu. So like there's like 15-year-olds that I learn from, and but then like so there's like this cyclical thing, and there's all these microcosms within communities and these interesting power dynamics, whereas like somebody's a mentor to somebody who's then being menteed by somebody else, and like we're all just influencing each other, and it's very like organic, and it feeds back on itself, which is again like going all the way back to the beginning, why I think like the people that you choose to surround yourself with are like likely the most important thing, like decision that you can make. I feel very lucky when I was younger. Like I remember this forever when I was younger, playing in a band, and me and my like best friend decided like we were gonna like like we did some drugs together for the first time, and we just decided, he's just like, we never do drugs the day after we do drugs. And I think that like having people to explore things with that were like able to do it intentionally and able to hold each other accountable is why like I'm fortunate enough to have like explored a lot of things and never gotten addicted to them personally, because of the people that I did them with. Whereas like you could find some people that just it's a negative feedback loop versus a positive feedback loop. And so having people that are intentionally like in sober community, I think it probably makes it easier for people who relapse, because they understand, and they can come back to the community, and they can, like we all just understand that we're like making mistakes, but we're trying to get better, and we're all like on this path of being like, hey, we're trying to be better than, like I'm trying to be better than like I was like yesterday or last week. I'm not trying to be better than you. And you have your own problems that you're trying to get with, and like this person has their own problems that they're trying to get over with, but we're all like just trying to be authentic.
Sorry, I'm choking on my words here.
No,
But
you're good.
there are two things I wanted to jump in on there, which that I really liked, which was the whole like when you were talking about with the band, like don't do drugs the day after you do drugs, like the whole idea of like having people in a group, no matter the size of it, hold each other accountable, and what you were talking about with jujitsu too, like you're learning from someone that's probably learning from someone else, kind of like that bit of a trickling down. Um, I like the idea that like even though role models or people you can learn from can have a big impact on people and communities, it kind of works in tandem too, or like vice versa, where ideas like that, where like a community, like the group of people, can have such a huge impact on one person as well. I was wanting to hear your thoughts on that idea as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, when you are in a community, or whether or not that's like a few people or, dozens of people, you want to show up for that community in a certain way. And I think a good example is like last week or the week before, a lot of the people that have been hanging out at Roots and Leaves like went to Tumbleroot for an open mic, which, you know, for the viewers who don't know, it's just a regular bar and venue,
Mm-hmm.
and I love Tumbleroot. And there were, you know, some people, like, I will have a drink occasionally, you know, generally like with a nice meal or something like that, and you know, some of these people in this community do drink. Some people can't even be around it, but like there were people who were like, you know, I was thinking about getting a beer, but I don't want to like get a beer like in front of these people, you know. And it's not that like you're necessarily like keeping secrets from them, but I think it's like a way that you're showing up for these people, you know. And I think it's really important, especially in, you know, in an alcohol focused society, to be there and show that's like, hey, like I'm here having just as good of a time without you, without a beer in my hand. Not that there's anything wrong with having a beer in your hand, but like there's a way that you show up. And so I think that like the way you show up for your community, you know, like I want to, it's like when there was like, I guess there probably still is an open mic, but there was like a really strong open mic crew there for a little bit, and like I always wanted to show up with a new song, you know, because like that's like what that community was focused on, was sharing art. And so I was like, I want to show up with this, and I want to sit around and listen to my friends that are sharing their music or their poetry. And so I think the way you show up to a community, which is, you know, something I've explored on one of the interviews that I did, you know, he was talking about how he had this reputation of the person who finishes the drinks, you know. And so at some point it became like that's who he was. So like even if he didn't feel like it, he had to be the last one drinking, because that was his reputation, that was his identity, and that's how he had to show up for that community. And now in a sober community, it's like, hey, I want to show up as, you know, maybe I want to be a leader in this community, or maybe, you know, I'm not, you know. It's like, but you show up in a certain way and you hold each other accountable. I think that that's the thing. Whereas like we've had people in these sober communities like show up drunk, and I think it's important not to just be like, well, get out of here, but to like hold that person and be like, hey, like we get it, it's not okay, you know, we know that, you know, it's, you're not supposed to show up this way, but like we still care about you, and you still show up for each other.
I think it's interesting you bring up that last point, because it's like that's like such a true thing. Like especially with like the early days of Roots and Leaves, like the early days of the first like open mic.
Mm-hmm.
I felt like the same energy with like having to show up, having to have a new poem every week, having to be this person that had like a piece ready, because I had many friends like went up to share music, poetry, or pieces, and not only would I sit down and intently like really listen and digest it, I felt like I had to reciprocate that same feeling, as
Mm-hmm.
well as showing up with a different piece every week. And it did like, even though I had a lot of people that like really encouraged me to like keep pursuing poetry, keep making it, I kind of, it got to like a point where like I really, really got burnt out on it. And until I did have one friend that said, it's like, it's okay if you don't show up with a new piece every week, man. It's all right. Cause like we do this to have fun, share it, share a piece of ourselves, but it's not okay if it starts becoming a thing that's hurting you as a person. Like I had to have someone like there to stop me, hold me back a bit, and that's totally okay, you know. Uh, it's really interesting because I feel like even sometimes in like a physical environment, like this is kind of like a term that came mostly from the internet, but like parasocial relationships and such, I feel like that is something that can kind of bleed into like a physical community
I'm
and
not familiar
such.
with that term. What is parasocial relation?
Parasocial is like, let's put it into perspective. Like you have this online personality that live streams a lot, like 8 hours every day, and you have people that interact with the chat essentially of that stream. And it gets to the point where like they show up to that stream so much, but they've never personally talked to this person, never had an authentic conversation, connected, or even been face to face. They feel like they know them so much. They know them, like they know them personally, and they kind of feel like they know them just as well, even if it's like vague comments to like the whole community rather than an individual, essentially, kind of like that. I feel like that's like something that can kind of like fall into like physical stuff too, because like and this is kind of something that like falls into like gossip culture too. Like I hear something about someone in a at a bar or a coffee shop I'm a regular at, and it can kind of turn into this idea of like if I hear like one bad thing about a person who I've never talked to, it can kind of like just that becomes their whole identity that I know about them. Same with like the he's the guy that he's the one that finishes his drink. He has to be the last one drinking. For some people that never have talked to him, that is his identity to that community, and it can have really unfortunate side effects. Especially on the people and the individual himself.
Yeah, I think that's true, and this actually kind of like harkens back to something that you said like a few minutes ago that I liked, and you were like starting to, like, I forget exactly how it was, but it was kind of touching on the idea of when identifying with a community, like even a physical one, goes too far.
Yeah.
Like I had a friend who was like a regular at Roots and Leaves, who talked about how like he got to the point where like he needed to show up every day because like he was addicted to the community.
Yeah,
He
it
hadn't
can
drank in
happen.
a long time. And so like even at that point it's like, oh, like I identify as a regular Roots and Leaves, I identify as a regular Remix, I identify as somebody who drinks this coffee versus that coffee, or I need to go here every day. Like even that can reach a tipping point. It's like the toxic new age culture that's like so sober that they're better than everybody else. It's like, hey, I think you took this a little too far,
No, yeah, that's like a big thing. That's actually something I kind of struggled with for a little bit. Because I have a drink named after me at Roots and Leaves, and I made it a very big thing about myself to if I ever brought a friend to Roots and Leaves to introduce them to Kava and Kratom, very much made it a mission. It's like I will never ever introduce them to my drink unless they like actually like Kava, Kratom, and the community of the bar. Because my sole purpose always was not to be the person that's identifies as like, oh, I'm the regular, I'm the guy that has a drink named after him. I want to be the person that's introducing a friend of mine or someone new to the culture of it, essentially. Because even though it's like Roots Leaves is how it is, I've been to other kava bars. I still it's kind of interesting to say now that I'm like speaking it out loud, but I feel like I have a duty to like kind of give the due respect to the culture of kava and create them, like have them drink the shell as it is, not like the specialty kavas that some bars have, or like the specialty kratom teas, the ethnobotanical teas they may have. Like it's like, I'm gonna buy you these two drinks, I'm gonna buy you a traditional shell, I'm gonna buy you a traditional tea, you don't have to finish them if you don't want, but this is how it's traditionally served, this is how it is, this is the main drink of like this sober bar, essentially. This is the main ingredient, this is the main thing that's put into everything.
And having respect for that, people have been drinking kava and kratom for 3,000 years longer than either of us have been alive.
Exactly.
Like we are such like less than like a drop in the bucket of that culture, which can even again be taken too far, because kratom is addictive, and you can like while I know like people who kratom is the reason they don't do heroin anymore. I know people who have ended up in the hospital because of kratom, and like anything can be taken too far. You can go too hard on anything.
Yeah, like truly anything can become an addiction. Like your friend, for example, like he became addicted to showing up to the bar, showing up. He was addicted to the community, and that is something kind of like what I was saying earlier, where whether it's consciously or unconsciously, like the community ends up becoming like their sole identifying factor, and that can, I think, more often than not, that can be like a bit of an unhealthy thing,
Totally.
especially if it's not like something your life like mostly gravitates around specifically.
And it's nice to like have that community to like rely on, but it's also you need to admit that if I moved away from Santa Fe tomorrow, that community would go on just fine,
Yeah,
and there
exactly.
would be people that would miss it, and that's what I want. Like I don't want to have like the pressure of like, oh, if I leave, then like this kava bar will go out of business. It's like no, like it's bigger than me. It's bigger than you. It's bigger than any of our friends. And people leave and they come, and there's people that have been going to a community for like a couple months or for 3 years, and they're at some point they're each like an equal member of the community, and it has nothing to do with whether or not you've been there for several years or just a few weeks. Like people come in and their personality becomes a part of like a group, and we're all forming this thing together, and it's bigger than everybody.
Yeah, no, it's that's like perfectly like you like you got the idea I wanted to get across. So like no matter what, like community is something that can be self-sustaining. It's bigger than all of us. We contribute to like our nickels in the hat, but it's something that eventually like is self-sustaining, whether it's the people or the environment. Like it was really great like going to that Tumbleroot open mic and seeing so many of the Roots and Leaves regulars
Oh
over
yeah,
there.
you were there.
Yeah, we were like, it was very brief. We were passing ships in the
Mm-hmm.
night. We were like, hi. I had like a beer in my hand because it's like it's not about the culture of the community. It's the people of the community. So it's like I didn't feel like it would be a death sentence, like you were saying earlier. I didn't feel specifically like it would be a death sentence to just have one beer and then call it
No,
there.
I mean,
Just have fun, support the little business, give them a little business.
yeah,
Yeah,
and there is nothing. Like I don't believe that there is anything like inherently evil about alcohol. I think it would have been really weird if we all showed up and everyone was like, "We're chugging beers, let's see how much we can drink. We're getting messed up, But I think there's a way to treat it. You can treat beer or wine with respect in the same way that you can treat kava with respect,
yeah,
in the sense
exactly.
that like, hey, this is like especially like a place like Tumbleroot or any brewery that like takes pride in making this thing in a quality sense, and they take pride in the flavors. And like I'd imagine that like most beers are like healthier than like a Coca-Cola, you know?
Yeah,
And so like pulling it back to the documentary, like the thing that I tell people is like I'm not against alcohol, I'm against alcohol culture. I'm against things that say, it's like the NFL. Like I'm not against like football, but I think there's something really toxic in the modern way that is presented, where it's like it's alcohol and toxic sexuality to sell product, when it's like, hey, well, there's nothing wrong with healthy competition. Football is a cool sport, but like when you center it on like drinking a lot in the parking lot before you go in, and then drinking every time your team does something, and then that ruins your week if they lose.
yeah.
Like there's something toxic about that, where there's nothing toxic about beer. Like beer's like delicious, and I've like come around. I went for years not drinking at all, and now it's like I can have a beer occasionally, and actually like two beers does not make me feel good, but like a beer, it's like, hey, that was like actually pretty good with like this burger.
All right. Yeah. I think that is an interesting thing to open up on with like the toxic communities. But as much as I want to like jump into that, we are kind of hitting our time limit here. So I want to leave off with one question and then some like whatever closing thoughts you may have. But I do this with every guest star I have on the podcast, which is if you were to leave us a music recommendation, whether it's just something you like or something that's impactful to the conversation, what would it be?
Oh man, I think you gave me warning for this, and I didn't think about it ahead of time.
I give myself a warning every week, and it can be last minute sometimes as well.
A music recommendation. What do you want? A song or an album or an
It
artist?
could just be a song,
It
something
can be
very
a
simple.
song.
Yeah.
Um, oh man. Well, I guess the first thing that's coming to mind is I'm trying to pick a song. I haven't actually listened to this band in a while. This band Mother Mother.
Mother.
They're from Vancouver, and they were a major part of my life for a while. And I guess this song "Ghosting" off their album "Oh My Heart" was that's an amazing song. And I think that whole album is really great. Their first several albums are really great, and the new ones probably are good too. I just honestly, for some reason, haven't kept up with them.
What was the name again of the album or the recommendation?
The song is, the band is Mother Mother.
Mother.
The song is "Ghosting" off of
Ghosting.
their album "Oh My Heart."
Oh My Heart. Okay, awesome. Any particular reason for that?
That was like a very important song, and not like content wise, and like now that I'm like thinking about it, like it's kind of like sometimes like songs can like resonate with you on like melodic and harmonic levels without resonating with you on like a lyrical level.
Oh, exact. I 100%
You know?
agree with that.
But I don't know that they were my favorite band for almost a decade, and they still hold a dear place in my heart. And I think that whole album's incredible. And that song is, has some of my favorite harmonies in it. Like the lead singer is a male, and then there's two female backup singers, one of which is his sister, and so their voices work so well together, being siblings. And I don't know, maybe there's something about their Canadian accents I like too, but I don't know.
That's great. That's a great answer. So, but thank you so much, Monty, for coming on to the episode. Before we close out here, is there any closing thoughts you want to leave us off on?
I don't know. I think we did a good job covering most things. I don't know. I just, find your communities in person.
Yeah.
You can find so much more authenticity, and you realize, like, once you, like, when you hang out with people in person, you realize how much more you have in common with everybody. Like, we all have so much in common, and I think, like, we're losing that when you, like, identify, when you make, like, things that you like your identity. I think that gets troublesome, and there's nothing wrong with liking things, but there's a problem with identifying as somebody who likes Batman. Even though Batman's awesome.
I don't think I could agree anymore. I definitely think we're like living in an age right now where there's much more disconnect. There's a lot of people just autopiloting, not really putting in the effort to like be authentic, be vulnerable, open up to people in whatever environment it may be, but especially in like the physical area, whether that might just be a product of our generation, the culture, or whatever it is. I really appreciate you saying that. I really appreciate you coming on here to talk about it today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, this
my
was
first
great.
podcast, so thank you, Dalen.
Yeah, of course.
First time I've ever been on a podcast.
It's awesome. But with that, we're going to end off the episode. Thank you for showing up, Monty. Thank you to everyone that came to the cafe today. And yeah, we're out of here. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.